Another edition of Beat the Closing Number presented by thelines.com. You can follow us on Twitter at thelines US. You can follow our sub-in co-host, the sub for Moneylines, who's on poker duty today, I guess. Steven Andres on Twitter. Is it at Steven Andres 1, Steven, or am I?
Yeah, I lost the original to a Russian bot at some point. So we're at Steven Andrus 1 at this point. And hey, good luck to Mo. I mean, a 6-figure payout if he takes this thing down. He's down to the final table, 6 left. So good use of a half day. We'll allow
it. Steven is the boss, so he is allowing though, like he said, to take that day off. Remember to give the video a thumbs up and ring the bell to get notifications whenever the Lines releases a new sports betting video on any market, including the NFL, just like this one. And we have maybe baseball playoffs coming up, and Steven does his podcast too, the Mega Pod with Matt Brown and Adam Candy, I think is how you pronounce his last name, right?
That's correct. Yep, Adam Candy.
All right, first time's a go for me on that pronunciation. So if you're new to the podcast, Beat the Closing Number, here's how we do things on Mondays. We break down some of the biggest line movement along with a handful of games that have attracted our interest so far. We have 4 games to discuss along with a few where the line has seen significant movement in regards to the key number of a touchdown or a field goal. And then we'll hit on, like I mentioned, 4 or so games that spark our interest. If we have time, Steven has a futures bet, individual player award that he is taking a peek at here ahead of week number 3. But Steven, looking at a few games of note here that we've seen some adjustment to the look-ahead line, and one's not necessarily around the key number, at least the one that we're starting around with, Chargers and Vikings. LA was favored on the look-ahead line, 1.5-point road favorite in Minnesota, battle of 0-2 teams. Now it's Minnesota -1.5, -1 at some shops. There is I think a Chargers -1 still available. So I know, Steven, you were messaging me before we got started, and we'll get your thoughts on a second, just in terms of if you were looking to take LA or Minnesota on a teaser leg, maybe still need to wait on that in terms of getting the hook either way. Minnesota, a league worst, -6 in regards to turnover differential. Buffalo out from -5.5 on the look-ahead line, now to -7 at Washington. And Bengals-Rams, probably the most significant movement of the bunch. Cincinnati was -7.5 on the look-ahead, over a touchdown favorite at home against the LA Rams. It's reopened, or it actually reopened after the first couple set of games. So after the late afternoon games finished yesterday, it reopened at Bengals -6.5. Then this morning it dipped down to -3.5 with the conclusion that Burrow could miss the game after he re-injured his calf. And then as of 10, 15 minutes ago, after Schefter reported that Burrow could very well miss this game, and of course when you have a major newsbreaker like that go to Twitter with news like that, the line's going to dip even further, even though the injury may be already baked in. And it's under the key number of 3 now at Bengals -2.5, -2. So of those 3 games, Steven, obviously Bengals-Rams is going to stick out. But anything of interest to you from a betting perspective?
Yeah, just a side note, if it's not Joe Burrow, it's rookie Jake Browning out of Washington as the backup, and they do have Will Grier, the preseason hero from Dallas, on their practice squad. So that's what we're looking at if it's not Joe Burrow. So, and also keep in mind, when it comes to calf injuries, that can lead to an Achilles if you're not careful. It's exactly what happened with Aaron Rodgers with a calf injury that didn't quite heal all the way and unfortunately popped in week 1. So I'm sure that's on the mind of the Bengals trainers and coaching staff as well here, just with the high risk of making this even worse than a calf injury out there. It happens all the time. And it's the one injury where NFL teams are typically extremely cautious with because of the possibility of a season-ending injury if they're not. The Chargers-Vikings game, right, Eli? Two desperate teams here. 2 teams that we would agree, I think, both have played well offensively, other than the turnovers for the Vikings. They've been great in yards per play. And the line movement here is very just notable for me because it appears any chance we had of a Vikings teaser leg up to 7.5 looks like it's out the window already here at lunchtime on Monday. And if you're going to play the teaser, you're going to have to like the Chargers because it looks like we're moving in that direction. There's kind of market split on who the favorite should be in this game, but at least the early week line movement now is going to install the Vikings as a favorite, which makes sense to me. I mean, the Chargers defense has not looked good in the first couple of weeks. The Vikings, I think home field is mostly overstated at this point when it comes to betting the NFL. But if there is one team that it seems there's a consensus on that should get at least a little bit of a bump or more of a bump than other places, it is Minnesota. So, I think anywhere around a pick 'em here is probably correct, but with a high total, maybe you don't want to take the Chargers on a teaser leg there. And lastly, that Buffalo game, Eli, Mo hit the nail on the head. This is why we do the look ahead column with thelines.com to note some games where we think there is definitely a chance to get closing line value. If you want to just take the chance that the quarterback won't get hurt in the game, if you want to bet it on the look ahead, and he was right on the money. The Bills minus 5.5 on the look ahead, now up to 6.5. There is a 7 on the board as well. I'm very curious if this closes at 6.5, Eli, or if Buffalo at Washington will close 7.
Yeah, it's a good point. So just a couple notes for me on the few games you mentioned. First off, with Bills at Washington, I thought some of the negative comments in regards to, not really from bettors per se. I know maybe you lowered Buffalo in your power ratings over at thelines.com, NFL power rankings that we all have a say in each week. You did Buffalo maybe lower than the rest of us. I thought the hate towards the Bills after week 1 was, again, a little too much for my liking, just because, especially when you consider that the market was in love with the Raiders, at least up until kick on Sunday morning, up until the game kicked off in the early afternoon slate, because Buffalo closed as, I think, a 7-point favorite. And Josh Allen has historically struggled. Granted, it's a smaller sample size when it comes to Robert Saleh's tenure with the Jets. But when you look at how Allen has underperformed against the Jets in the 3 games he's played against that Saleh-led defense, when it comes to facing pressure and having issues with it versus other defensive fronts and dealing with pressure and being able to escape outside the pocket. So it seemed like to me going into that game in the first place that Saleh had his number. But I digress on that game. Going back to Bengals-Rams and what Baltimore did yesterday, I know Burrow is getting a lot of the headlines, as he should, and it seemed like he tweaked that calf. And to your point, you don't want to have any sort of torn ACL and completely
Achilles.
Bomb your season if you're the Bengals. So sitting him out against the Rams, especially with LA's secondary being below league average and then some, especially at cornerback, seems pretty fitting. And maybe you consider the Bengals under the key number of a field goal, even with a below average replacement level quarterback, whether it's Browning or whomever starting for Burrow. But the Bengals secondary continues to underwhelm after losing their starting safety duo going back to last year and the last few years with Jesse Bates and Von Bell. They allowed 7.2 yards per attempt to Lamar Jackson, and even before the injury to Burrow, and especially afterwards, McDonald's game plan and John Harbaugh at that, what they were able to do, and we saw this going back to last year, playing that split safety zone coverage, which zone has seemingly always given Burrow issues, but the Ravens game plan going back to the last 3 times or 4 times, I guess, including the playoff game, I think it's been phenomenal. And again, it's been an issue for Burrow when it comes to facing zone coverage. And then lastly, with the Chargers and the Vikings, I don't know how I'm trying to bet this game, because if I do end up betting it at all, and it's so funny, the market has already taken a position on Minnesota after the market continuously bet against the Vikings when they were reasonably lucky last year, and now they're unlucky, even though the regression monster in the turnover department may just be going the other way. So
this
maybe
is 2
you
weeks
buy
in a row, Eli. 2 weeks in a row, the market's coming in on the Vikings. They moved that number a lot against the Eagles on Thursday night.
Yeah, and I guess when you look at the closing number at 5.5, the Eagles did cover that. But for anybody that got Minnesota throughout the week, for the most part, ended up covering on the Vikings. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out because maybe, again, this just boils down to the Vikings. You don't always see it where the market going into the season on one team where a team faces this much regression like we've seen from the Vikings when it comes to turnovers over the first couple games. I mean, -6 in the turnover department speaks for itself after sitting at least above average when it came to takeaways and plus turnovers last year for that Vikings defense that, again, was putrid besides the turnover luck that they got. And when we saw second half point differential and especially that comeback against the Colts late season, and I think Saturday or Christmas Eve, whatever it was. So I'm not particularly interested on Minnesota when it comes to this week, but if you want to take a look at the Chargers on a teaser leg, or if this flips back to LA and maybe taking a look at Minnesota, I don't blame you.
Yeah, for me, it's an interesting conversation because coming into the year, this is a 13-win team that basically everybody that's in the sports betting world would agree vastly outperformed that number of wins that they got. They had a negative point differential for the year. It was kind of a historic situation where, variance went their way. But at the same time, I kind of disagreed with rating them as around a 500 team. They 13 wins down to 8 would be, an under on their win total. 8.5 was what was out there on the market. I said, I think there's going to be regression. I'm just not sure there's going to be 5-win regression. So it's interesting now that with the prices that we're getting with Minnesota in the market, perhaps more people agree with me on that because I could certainly see in a situation like week 1 where Minnesota is a big favorite not being interested in backing that because of the issues they have on defense, because of Cousins' propensity to turn the ball over. But then the last couple of weeks, big dog to the Eagles, despite the Eagles being a little banged up. And now to start the week, home dog against the Chargers, who don't have a great defense. And Minnesota through 2 weeks has moved the ball better than everybody except the Miami Dolphins. So if they do clean up those turnovers, absolutely they should win this game. So it's just an interesting situation where, maybe the pendulum's going back the other way where the fading of the Vikings in the market has gone too far, and now we're back to having some interest on them.
One thing to note in regards to that game would be the Vikings offensive line with Darisaw potentially being out and Bradbury, especially against that Chargers defensive front led by Joey Bosa. So, because the Chargers would have a mismatch there, as seemingly every team does, especially the Eagles on Thursday Night Football, getting pressure on Cousins a lot in that first half in particular. But, Steven, before we get into 4 or so games that we want to hit on, maybe a futures bet that you're interested in, want to do a quick recap on how Mo and I did going back to week 2. We're 4-3 on the season, I believe. I ended up splitting in week 2, lost Denver, and congratulations to you and every single Commanders backer out there. Broncos blew a 21-3 lead. I thought
weirdest game ever. Absolutely weirdest game ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can get into that for a quick sec. But, and then I got, maybe, I don't even want to say unlucky with Denver because of how they collapsed. I don't really put too much of that on Russell Wilson. Denver's defense was a big part of that collapse too. But I got fortunate a bit. I thought the handicap was good even without Phillips in for the Dolphins defensive front. They were able to get a lot of pressure on that banged up Patriots offensive line, and the Patriots defense held up even though their cornerback depth was tested throughout that game on the injury front. But under 46.5 got home for me on a hair, a centimeter, and then some probably on the pitch back from Gesicki to the Patriots offensive lineman that, again, was stopped inches short of the marker on review. It wasn't even on the initial call. So I'll take it, and I'll run with it. I'll take a split. How did your bets go in week 2, Steven?
Around 500, honestly. It's funny. I sprayed and prayed in week 2. I bet a lot of stuff. And when
sprayed and prayed can be taken out of context. Just to say that.
Well, I stole that from Rich Ryan, our buddy over on the Gridiron Gamble show. Who,
okay.
Mo and Brett Colson are co-hosts on as well. I think it's hilarious. But pending the Browns, who I got at a decent price on the money line earlier this week. So waiting on that on Monday Night Football as we record right now. But we get that home, we'll have another above 500 week. Going back to that Washington-Denver game, 10 yards per play for the Broncos in the first half, and I just turned it off. I just checked the box score at halftime just to make a note of it, thinking it was a blowout, and moved on, and was like, wow, Denver looks good offensively, which was what my concern was coming into the game, and I was dead wrong about that. Now, the other concern I have about Denver certainly came to fruition, especially in the second half. It seemed like the market assumption has been that you can just assume that the Broncos will have just as good of a defense as they had last year. And that if they get some improvement from Sean Payton on offense, then we're talking about maybe an above 500 team here. I don't think you can assume the Broncos defense is anywhere near what they put up on the field last year. And I think a big part of that is them losing their defensive coordinator, Evero, over to the Carolina Panthers. So they have taken a big step back here through the first couple of weeks. They had the worst pressure rate in the league in week 1. I'm still waiting to see what the numbers are for week 2 here, but
they got good pressure in the first half on Howell, not in the second half.
Yeah, my eyes said I would agree with that. I watched the first half and I agree with that. They definitely got some good pressure. Whatever adjustments they made at halftime, they got mollywopped in the second half. It was, the final score doesn't kind of bear that out because they hit a Hail Mary at the end.
Right.
But other than that, they went from basically 10 yards per play in the first half to only, 4.5 for Washington to losing yards per play for the game. That's how bad they were offensively and defensively in the second half. So interesting to say the least. We'll see what happens. I still think Washington, these teams both might be bottom 5-6 teams in the NFL, to be honest with you. So that was my biggest observation with Denver and Washington, and completely wrong in the first half, completely right in the second half. Just a weird game. Other than that, I think Tampa Bay is an interesting discussion moving forward here. I bet Tampa Bay. I thought Chicago was a dumpster fire. Plenty of evidence by the Twitter All 22 camera crowd showing that Chicago is just not being coached properly, not being coached at an NFL level. And Tampa took advantage of that. And moving forward, I think the assumption on Tampa was they're not going to win a lot of games because Baker might get hurt behind a bad offensive line. And, then they might start selling off pieces. Well, as constituted right now, Eli, I think Tampa's closer to a league average team than the second to worst win total we saw coming into the season. As long as those guys are healthy, I think they are an interesting team to back as dogs here moving forward. I don't know what you think, but that's kind of where I'm at. That was the most interesting winning bet I had last week.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that game. We'll touch on the Bucs, Eagles, and Tampa's outlook. I know you were giving a look towards them in the futures market as well. Not to win the NFC or anything like that, but in a crappy division definitely warrants at least a little bit of interest and a conversation, to say the least. So let's talk about some of those Week 3 games, including Bucs, Eagles. We'll wrap with the second of 2 Monday Night Football games, Rams, Bengals being the other. I'll share my thoughts on Denver a little bit further along in the podcast with Broncos Dolphins, an intriguing game, at least I think, from a market perspective. Yeah. So first game we're going to touch on, Steven, Thursday Night Football, Giants at Niners. This line spiked to 10.5 this morning, total between 44.5 and 45. Line is up from the look-ahead line, and it was sitting 9.5 last week. I think in the offseason going into the 2023 campaign ahead of week 1, this look-ahead line was 6. So we've certainly seen the market adjust to the Giants, especially even with that comeback victory down 20-0 or so in the first half to the Arizona Cardinals. San Francisco does not cover, or maybe pushes in some spots. I know some people got Niners or Rams +7, Niners -7, depending on which way you want to look at it. But LA going for a field goal in the closing seconds, down by 10.
God bless
You have to
Sean
wonder.
McVay.
Yeah.
Good coaches win, great coaches cover, Eli. Simple as that.
You have to wonder if he knew the point spread. And I would say yes. I don't know why else you would kick a field goal in that spot and not go for a Hail Mary unless you're trying to help out people that bet on the Rams, people in the Rams organization. Who the hell knows? But either way, the Rams cover with some magic in the closing seconds. Shout out to Matt Gay for anybody that bet the Rams. They're definitely singing his praises this morning. So, initial thoughts, Steven, whether you have a bet or are thinking about a bet on this game for Giants and Niners.
I think the numbers gotten away from us at this point to be interested in the Niners. Preseason
Even without Barkley playing.
Yeah, I mean, it's less about Barkley, and here it's a lot of freaking points, right? First of all, let's start with that. Like, this is a lot of points for an NFL game, and to me, it signals that maybe the Giants are not viewed in the market as the league average team, the slightly above average team that a lot of us thought they were coming into the season. I think at this point, I haven't finished my power ratings for week 1 or for week 3, but the Giants are not going to be anywhere near the middle of the pack here for me moving forward, because I thought from the beginning that they didn't have as much talent as a lot of people thought they did. I mean, when we're trying to rationalize Isaiah Hodgins as a good receiver, that's kind of a red flag. So, and Darren Waller as some earth-shattering addition in the offseason being, a difference maker, I think shows you what was actually in the cupboard to start with. So, regardless of Saquon Barkley, this offensive line cannot block the San Francisco 49ers. This defensive front for the Niners may not be at the earth-shattering level of the Cowboys from what we've seen from them to start the year, but they're not far behind. The Niners have a very, very good top 3 front 7, and I don't think the Giants can block them, whether Barkley's getting the ball, whether Breed is getting the ball, or Daniel Jones is throwing the ball. So that's the starting point in this handicap for me. I understand why this has gotten ballooned out, and I think it's, even though the market has kind of been against the 49ers the past couple of weeks, we saw Pittsburgh money against the Niners in week 1. We saw some late Rams money coming in when they got ballooned out a little bit here. I think this is two things happening at the same time, Eli. I think this is a market correction on the week 1 rating of the Niners and another correction on the Giants downward from what we've seen the first couple of weeks here. So it's a stay away for me at this point.
Yeah, a couple notes for me on the game. Number 1, I got to give credit to Purdy, although I also want to get your opinion on this on the back end. Yeah, no, he's safe throws, but we still have yet to see. I'm always going to come out with a caveat. I always have at least one disclaimer on Beat the Closing Number.
Of course,
we've yet to see Purdy face adversity in terms of a double-digit deficit and seeing what kind of production, what kind of output we get from him in that sort of game state. But to his credit, 4th highest dropback EPA per play among qualified quarterbacks in week 2, 2 spots behind Tua, who we'll get to when we break down Dolphins and Broncos. So he's performed very well over the first couple weeks, certainly benefited from some turnovers in week 1 via Kenny Pickett and that Niners defense going back to their season opener. So a question still kind of sit there for me with Purdy. If San Francisco, and when they do maybe go up against Dallas, and if they face a deficit in that game, then what happens? Kind of like last year, he never faced a negative game script, and we didn't get to see what happened in the NFC Championship game or what may have happened in the NFC Championship game had he not suffered that injury. But back to the Giants, just barely outgaining the Cardinals in yards per play, despite that massive comeback. Not only do you have the Barkley injury and the potential that he's going to be out, I think Rappaport considered him to be a stretch or already coined him that going into this Thursday Night Football game. And then Andrew Thomas also could be out, which is the Giants' best offensive lineman, let alone their left tackle and blindside blocker for Daniel Jones. So it's a big number, like you mentioned, just by the way some of these spreads end up working out. Maybe you get a Giants backdoor cover if they're down by 17 and they score to make it a 10-point game in the final minute or so. Who knows? But like you mentioned, this 49ers defensive line and no key injuries of note anywhere for San Francisco in their lineup. Bosa, Armstead, Hargrave, Farrell going up against the Giants offensive line, especially if Thomas is out. I probably can't bet New York in this game.
Yeah, big yikes in the trenches here in this one.
Yeah, goes without saying.
I do agree with you. I think it's an open debate of whether or not the 49ers can match up with the Cowboys in this year's version. For me, it's mostly because they've replaced their right tackle, Colton McKivitz, who is now taking over from Mike McGlinchey, and he failed miserably week 1 against TJ Watt. He got, played like a fiddle, and Purdy was sacked 3 times. So against elite defenses, I'm curious if the Niners will be as good this year. But, I mean, at this point, I'm done waiting for Brock Purdy to fail because the Niners have scored 30 points in every single one of his starts except for one. He's not lost a regular season start yet. And the one start where the Niners didn't score 30 points, he went on the road on a short week to Seattle and had a passer rating over 100. So whether it's him or whether it's Shanahan, it doesn't matter. It works. So I think the Niners are clearly a top 5 team in the league at this point.
I'm with you there. I do have them behind Baltimore, which I know you disagree with. And unfortunately, we're not going to be talking Ravens or AFC North on this podcast.
I would be fine with a Super Bowl rematch against the Ravens. We'll put it that way. And hopefully the lights stay on for the full game this time.
On to the second game that we're going to discuss. Broncos at Dolphins. Very intrigued by this game. Look ahead line was Miami -6. It spiked to 7 as of late last night, early this morning. Now it's back to 6.5, total anywhere between 46.5, 47. I know you could probably guess where I'm going with this game, Steven, and I am looking at Denver here, which probably doesn't surprise you at all.
No Fangio revenge factor here, man?
No Fangio. Well, of course there's going to be the Fangio revenge factor, but I'm not accounting that for my handicap. So just to give some perspective on the New England-Miami game from Sunday Night Football last night as we're recording this on Monday afternoon here. So Miami escaped with that win on the surface because New England was driving, and like we hit on from the get-go, Patriots centimeters short and probably a little bit shorter than a full centimeter from getting the first down and continuing that drive to potentially tie things up and get overtime against the Dolphins. But per Football Outsiders, New England should have had a 2% win expectancy. And they wound up missing, or that was because the Dolphins wound up missing 2 field goals. I know you mentioned in our Discord channel, and people could head over to thelines.com and click on the Discord link in the top right-hand corner to see I think you have 2 bets for Monday Night Football for those listening or watching us on Monday afternoon, early Monday evening, if you want to check out the Lines Discord channel. You mentioned last night that you think the Dolphins are a Super Bowl contender. That liability at kicker for Jason Sanders, speaking of him, I think is big and massive, especially because of what we saw last night and how New England probably shouldn't have had a prayer to be competing in that game if Sanders hits one of those 2 field goals. And when I say competing, I mean to have a shot to go to overtime and potentially upset Miami, considering what Football Outsiders had to say in regards to their win expectancy. And then going back to the Broncos Commanders game, like we touched on from the beginning, Denver blows a 21-3 lead, but they did outgain Washington yards per play wise, 6.4 to 5.9. Russell Wilson's fumble in the second quarter when the Broncos, mind you, had the ball up 18 points, and he didn't make an effort, it appeared, to jump back on the ball, and that really flipped the script, at least to me. But Miami is allowing the highest expected points added per carry across the NFL. And a lot of that came in week 1, granted, but New England's offensive line woes and their depth really the Dolphins benefited from that, going back to the Week 2 game and the game we just mentioned, or I just mentioned, and New England's inability to establish the run, considering their offensive line depth and them being banged up at, I think, at least 2, if not 3 spots on their offensive line. Miami's secondary, though, is extremely exploitable, as we saw when Mac Jones went hurry up in that second half. I don't know why they didn't try it more in the first half, or why it took being down 16 points to the Eagles in Week 1 to go hurry up with Mac Jones, where he seems very comfortable. But Xavier Howard and Eli Apple, both below average when it comes to cornerback grade per Pro Football Focus. And I also think this is a look-ahead spot potentially with Miami, because you have Buffalo on deck at Buffalo in Week 4. So a huge spot. So although Broncos are exploitable in their own right, especially when it comes to Damari Mathis as their outside corner, opposite of one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL in Surtain, I think this number is a little bit big at 6.5. And I would love to get a 7, which I could definitely see it get it back to later on in the week. How are you approaching, or at least looking at, Denver, Miami, Steven?
I certainly see your point. I'll say this. Denver better score in this game, because with what my opinion now is of the Broncos defense, I don't think they're stopping Miami if they made Sam Howell look like Sam Howlitzer out there in the second half. So I think that Miami should get their points in this one. I think that I would like a little bit better decision making from Mike McDaniel, and I'm not going to blame Sanders for the blocked field goal. And I will say I will blame Mike McDaniel for the late 55-yard attempt when it was only 4th and 3. I would have much rather seen Miami go for 4th and 3 than kick a 55-yard field goal. And I hope that's a different decision if it ever presents itself again later in the season for McDaniel. So I think when healthy on the field, we have enough of a sample size now to say that Miami is one of the elite offenses in the NFL. I certainly hear your concerns about the defense, and they still are not going to have Jalen Ramsey till second half of the year, maybe even closer to the playoffs at cornerback. So if Denver can do what it did in the first half against Washington, sure, I can see them keeping pace here potentially if they can block up and protect against Fangio, who's apparently been okay blitzing a little more than what we're used to in the past. But maybe that's because he sees what his personnel is and what is required at this point. Or maybe he's confident that he can leave his couple of his corners like Xavier Howard out on an island if need be. So I certainly see your angle on that one for sure with how good the Broncos offense looked at times. I'm no decision for me at this point though, but I at least just want to say that any issues that you may have with the Dolphins statistically, I think you need to look hard at just the games where Tua, Tyreek, and Waddle have been on the field for them, because they have been absolutely elite when they have been together.
And that's a great point, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because Waddle did exit the Patriots game late with a concussion, so that's something to monitor too. Yeah, keep an eye on it if he's not out there. And the Dolphins have wide receiver depth, but just in terms of that secondary elite explosive playmaker,
not Waddle good, right? I mean, after Waddle, you're looking at River Craycraft and Braxton Berrios. So
Berrios made a couple nice plays last night, but yeah, he's not Jalen Waddle.
Right. To Tua's credit, he completed passes to 8 different receivers, so it's not like he's totally locked in on Waddle and Tyreek Hill. I thought he did a good job distributing in what Bill Belichick gave him, considering only 9 of his 21 completions were to Waddle and Tyreek Hill against the Patriots. But yeah, I 100% agree with you that if Waddle's potentially going to miss this game, then that kind of changes everything for the offense. It allows the defense to key in on Tyreek Hill and go single up against everybody else.
And one more injury to note, too, if Miami decides to rest Armstead at left tackle, or if he's not healthy enough to go for yet another game, as he's missed the first 2 so far, against a Denver pass rush that, yes, Bieniemy adjusted well in the second half against, and McDaniel could very well do the same thing. But Denver still, and maybe you get Frank Clark back. Again, these are all theoreticals, but the path is set up there, especially in a huge spot for Denver to have any shot to save your season. I understand the under-win total love that we saw from sharp bettors going into the year, and rightfully so, especially from what we've seen over the first couple games collapse-wise from the Broncos. But I'm going to continue to buy low on Denver most likely, and I'll probably get burned just like I did with the Commanders early in the season last year until I got my revenge.
Love Mims. Marvin Mims looks great, by the way.
Yeah, he does. Javonte Williams is not getting the touchdowns and maybe as many explosive runs as I would like for my fantasy team. By the way, we're going head-to-head this week in fantasy. Just want to let you know.
Apologies in advance, buddy.
All right, so now you have a couple games. I mentioned that I'm looking at Denver, and I will very likely be on them, and you'll probably see a bet pop up in our Discord channel. Again, link is over at thelines.com, top right-hand corner. You can find the best sportsbook promos as well and shop around for the best numbers over at thelines.com. So, game that's very interesting and is correlated to the game we just touched on because it involves the Patriots. They're 2.5 point favorites at the Jets in week 3. And this line on the look ahead, I believe, was 1.5, 2, probably 2 in most spots. Total of 37.5, which is not a surprise when it's Mac Jones and this Patriots offense against Zach Wilson. And, well, the Jets offense has talent outside of Wilson, but it is Zach Wilson, and that's all you need to say. So one thing to note, or a couple things to note before we get into your handicap for this game, Cowboys and Jets were actually pretty even when it comes to yards per play, despite the 20-point differential on the scoreboard to wrap it up. Dallas certainly benefited from going +4 in the turnover differential, and 3 of those turnovers, takeaways coming from Zach Wilson, 3 interceptions. And one thing to note for the Patriots offense, going back to yesterday's game against an exploitable Dolphins secondary, Patriots had the second fewest explosive play rate across the NFL, ranking in the second percentile in that particular category in week 2. And now they're going up against one of the best defenses in the league, at least on paper. And I know Dallas put up 30 points on the scoreboard, but again, you look at yards per play and how they benefited from 4 takeaways. Prescott and that Cowboys offense, which wasn't super efficient, benefited from good field position. So, Patriots, Jets, how are you handicapping this one, Steven?
Well, I will first start and say that this is going to happen sometimes because of when we record this show on Mondays and Monday afternoons. Games are going to move while we're recording, and this was probably going to be a bet for me, Patriots under 3 here. But as we've been recording, we're now looking at Patriots -3 basically across the board, including a little more expensive one at one of our partners. So very quick market reaction to take the Patriots here despite being on the road. And I suspect it's because they once again don't have confidence that Zach Wilson's going to be able to just play a clean game against Bill Belichick now this time. This poor guy gets another shot, right? And his first 2 games are against Micah Parsons and company and Bill Belichick now. Like, you can't script it any more difficult for Zach Wilson. It's terrible. At the same time, like, to your point, Patriots haven't really moved the ball that great. In the second half against the Eagles, I felt they did, but
that was hurry up. They going? That was the point I brought up with when we were talking about Broncos and Dolphins in regards to the Dolphins defense. Are we going to finally see Bill O'Brien adjust and give Mac Jones maybe a little more command of this offense?
Right. If Zach Wilson doesn't turn the ball over, I absolutely would be interested in Jets as a 3-point home dog here because the Jets defense matches up really well against the Patriots. The Patriots don't have anybody that concerns me or makes me worry the way a Dolphins offense or a Bills offense with Stephon Diggs does. Like, who am I going to be afraid of on the Patriots offense right now? Ramondre Stevenson? Like, the offensive line is also banged up. So, check that injury report as well. So, I'm going to have to do a lot of soul searching here, Eli, because initially I thought I was going to come on this show and tell you I'm betting the Patriots under 3, but that's gone now. And now I need to think really hard about, do I believe Zach Wilson can just not piss down his leg for once and take 3 as a home dog here, because this is not a game where, there's going to be a lot of points unless there's a pick six, which is always possible with these two quarterbacks. But other than that, it seems like getting 3 at home. And just checking the total here, I can't imagine it's a very high total, Eli. I don't know if you have it in front of you.
37.5.
Yeah, 37.5, and you're getting 3 with the home dog. That's on paper, that's pretty good if you can stomach Zach Wilson, which, stay tuned to the Discord. We'll find out at some point this week.
Well, a couple more injuries to note outside of the Patriots' offensive line. We saw their cornerback depth. I mean, it was depleted last night with first Jonathan Jones and then Marcus Jones getting hurt, I think, midway through the second quarter or early on in the second half, if it wasn't in the first half. So that's something to note. And then also Garrett Wilson exited the game late in the fourth quarter for the Jets.
Oh,
so you could be looking at Zach Wilson and Al Lazard as your quarterback, number one skill position, or at least wide receiver. And I mean, also play calling for the Jets. It's not just Mac Jones and the Patriots. Breece Hall was upset post-game for just getting, whether it was 4 touches overall or 4 carries, and that's Nathaniel Hackett coordinating your offense.
Yeah. They should be able to run on New England, though. I mean, Raheem Mostert in a bad offensive line went for chunk plays and more than 100 yards rushing. So,
but that's, to your point about betting against the Dolphins, not just when it comes to their passing offense. I mean, the rushing scheme is so elite, and that goes back to Shanahan, too, when we were touching on Niners-Giants. So, not to say that's a lot of it is driven by scheme, but when we handicap the Jets and their ability and their offensive line, mind you, which has a lot of question marks despite the lack of injuries, which was a concern going into the year, a lot different for me than Dolphins, Patriots, just because of the elite coaching and elite scheme on that side of the ball.
Yeah. I will give everybody one bet here. I thought I was going to do Patriots, but I don't want to come on here and not give a single bet. So, I know you don't like teasers as much as I do, Eli, but I'm going to give everybody a teaser here. Jaguars down to 2.5 at home against the Texans. Ravens down to 2 at home against the Colts.
So just out of nowhere, you come out with 2 games that we haven't discussed yet.
We'll talk more about it on the Megapod on Friday, but I felt bad that my Patriots bet went out the window. And, if one of those teams loses to the Texans or Colts, so be it, right? We tip our cap. But those 2 teams, big favorites, great offenses, down less than a field goal in a teaser feels really good this week.
I never thought I'd hear you back Baltimore in Eddie sense. So I'm happy in that regard. But one thing to know for the Ravens too, I know they went into Cincinnati and won that game, and I was very impressed. I thought, Steven, I don't know if you noted it when I wrote my betting preview for Bengals Ravens going back to last week, but I thought Monken went a little vanilla in that Texans game for a reason, and Lamar looked really good yesterday and against a Bengals secondary that I think you'll continue to see regression. And we touched on the line movement already in Rams Bengals, but that has a lot more to do with the quarterback position rather than a decimated secondary, especially at the safety position. But I'll be interested to see how the Ravens play it in the sense of their injuries, because like Miami, they have a huge week 4 game at Cleveland. So are we going to see Baltimore go a little light in terms of rushing, or not rushing, but playing some of their key players that have been banged up so far, like Humphrey, who could theoretically be ready to play this week? Or do you get him even healthier in a game where you probably don't need him against, whether it's Anthony Richardson coming off concussion protocol or Gardner Minshew, and a Colts team that has a lot of defensive concerns, even though you have Darius Leonard back and seemingly healthy on that side of the ball? So I like your Jags teaser, especially off of the Chiefs loss and against a Texans offense that is turnover prone, or at least prone to dealing with a deficit like we saw in that Colts game yesterday. I think that Ravens game could be a little bit of a fight. And I don't want to say sandwich spots, I drive more so to college sports rather than NFL. But the Ravens are coming off of a huge win at Cincinnati, especially considering they lost their last 2 games to the Bengals last year, and then they have a huge game on deck at Cleveland. So you wonder, foot off the gas pedal, and then who's going to be playing on the injury front? Yes, Harbaugh said post-game that Odell Beckham Jr. and Oweh, their defensive lineman or outside linebacker edge rusher that has performed the best out of any of their edge rushers to begin the season. It's not a long-term injury for either of those guys, but do they rest both of them just with the notion that you want them healthy for the Browns game? And among all the rest of their injuries up front with Ronnie Stanley and their center, you don't have Dobbins right now, and for the rest of the season, you don't have Marcus Williams probably till the second half of the year. So I'm really curious to see how Baltimore plays that game. And I think I could see a second half comeback similar to that Colts Monday Night Football game, whether it was last year or the year before that, where they came back in overtime from like a double-digit deficit and won that game. I hope for your sake it doesn't happen, and I do want to give you credit for giving a bet because your Patriots bet went out the window, at least so far.
I appreciate it, man. I'm a man of the people. I try. I fire from the hip.
All right, last game we're going to discuss, and I'll give you the floor to kick it off. Monday Night Football, 2nd at 2, after Rams and Bengals kickoff. Eagles and Bucks. This line was Philly minus 7.5 on the look ahead. It's down to 6.5, pretty much across the board, and a total of 45. How are you approaching this one? Handicap and spread and or total? I know you mentioned that you're kind of high on the Bucks in relation to the first 2 games.
And since we've been recording here for 45 minutes, it moved again, Eli. I'm seeing 5.5s and 6s now, so some early money in on the Bucks, and I kind of understand why, because if you just look at it from a numbers perspective, you have a Bucks team here who has faced the Vikings already, and an Eagles team that has faced the Vikings already. So if you just kind of look at it from numerically, what were the spreads when those 2 teams faced the Vikings? And the Bucks were basically a 4-point road dog at close to the Minnesota. So take away a couple points for home field. Let's just say the market had Tampa Bay as about a 2-point underdog on a neutral field against Minnesota, roughly. Eagles game at home against the Vikings closed around 5.5 or 6. So take away a couple points for home field. You could say the Eagles are about let's say 3.5, 4-point favorites. So if you just go by that, then roughly the Bucks should be about a 6-point dog to the Eagles on a neutral field. But this game is in Tampa in prime time. So should the number really be 6 if you're giving any type of home field advantage? And I would say probably not. So I am going to go and drive like hell to get across the bridge here, and because I live in Kentucky and we're not legal for another 10 days or so I got to go to Indiana, but I am going to bet the Bucks at +6 here on Monday Night Football against the Eagles. I like what I've seen from Tampa. I know that we've talked about this already a little bit, that I think the expectations coming into the season were for the Bucks to be a bottom 3 team. A lot of that is the depth of the roster. If they suffered key injuries to wide receiver or quarterback, they'd be shot and maybe tanking for the number 1 pick. But as constituted right now, in the present, this is much closer to a league average team, in my opinion. And Baker Mayfield, if you take away the first quarter of week 1, he was actually a top 10 quarterback by EPA success rate for the rest of that game against Minnesota, and I thought played pretty darn well against Chicago as well, albeit Chicago is a dumpster fire. So I think they can at least keep this close here at home against the Eagles, who I think are trying to figure things out a little bit here with the way defenses are playing them now, having an offseason to prepare and figure things out, and 2 new coordinators for Philadelphia as well. I think they've been fine. They've covered week 1. Luckily, they didn't cover and maybe should have lost that game if not for turnovers against Minnesota. So I think
they did cover the closing number, 5.5.
You're right. The closing
for those
number,
books
yes,
that had it.
Most of the tickets did not cash those Philadelphia bets. So, I think they're still maybe trying to figure some things out here. And Kelsey said as much on the post-game show on Thursday Night Football as well. Teams are going to play them different. I think this offense is going to have to be patient, which is going to mean far fewer blowouts than what we saw a year ago.
Yeah, and to your point with this Eagles offense and Brian Johnson, who I think has done a terrible job with play calling over the first couple weeks, that's also on Sirianni to an extent too. But outside of the 2 explosive passing plays against Minnesota to Devonta Smith, Jalen Hurts 2.6 yards per attempt on Thursday Night Football against that Vikings secondary.
Yeah, that's bad.
What? That's terrible. He looks indecisive. He does not look like he's in sync with Brian Johnson, to say the least. He looks like he's missing Shane Steichen and then some. And then injury-wise, too, with the Eagles on defense, if Bradbury and Blankenship are out, which the market seems to expect, or maybe it's just the adjustment on the Eagles. And by the way, NFC East odds, Philly and Dallas, and I bet Dallas to begin the season at around plus 190, plus 195 to win the NFC East. It's pretty much plus 110 for both of those teams to win this division, and that's not surprising at all. Also, defensively, for the Eagles on the injury front, Nakobe Dean on injured reserve. But Bradbury and Blankenship, especially as it concerns this game, 2 important injuries to keep in mind. And then outside of the Eagles on the offensive side of the ball, as you mentioned with Baker Mayfield, 9.3 yards per attempt. These 3 quarterbacks, this is a heck of a stat. These 3 quarterbacks finished 1, 2, and 3 in EPA per dropback in week 2 among qualified quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield, number 1, which again is no surprise considering he played the Bears, and I loved your Bucks play going into the game yesterday at 2.5. Josh Dobbs against the Giants, journeyman Josh Dobbs, and Gardner Minshew in a backup role against the Texans. That sums up the Professional Football League that Roger Goodell calls the NFL in week 2. That is truly remarkable that we see those 3 quarterbacks atop the list. I hope every single quarterback tonight underperforms, so no one
So it stays that way. Yeah.
Right. So it stays that way. But to your point about the Bucs, and you mentioned this in the Discord or maybe just on Slack. And by the way, to your point about driving over the bridge, I know whenever you don't message your Slack or whenever you don't answer on Slack, you're probably driving over to somewhere in Indiana.
It's that obvious, though. It's that obvious.
It's that obvious.
Quote,
and I know you
changing
very well.
locations, going to work somewhere else, changing locations, going to Indiana to make a bet.
So Tampa Bay is right now plus 450 to win the NFC South. You brought up that could be worth a sprinkle, and I don't hate that at all. Off to a 2-0 start, like we had on 2-0 outright, 2-0 against the number. They benefited, as you stated, from Justin Fields' incompetence and the Bears coaching staff, which you could say ad nauseum for the last half a decade or so. But it's not just Baker that's been impressive. Dave Canales, the Bucs' first-year offensive coordinator who came over from Seattle that resurrected seemingly Geno Smith's career. Going back to last season, Smith put up career numbers. And so it's not just the quote-unquote quarterback whisperer that Canales seems to be, and this is his first year, mind you, as a clear-cut offensive coordinator, at least from the role being actually defined as just that. This scheme is so similar to what Baker ran in Cleveland because it's a zone offense that he ran under Stefanski. And Baker had one of his best seasons, and you can make the case his only good season when the Browns made the playoffs that one year. Going back to 2020 when they beat Pittsburgh in the wild card round and then lost to Kansas City. And that was a heck of a divisional game. And you would also expect the Bucs from the standpoint that the Ravens may be resting and the Dolphins could conceivably also rest some of their guys this week with a huge week 4 game on deck. The Bucs arguably could have been resting. We don't know for sure, but Carlton Davis, one of the better cornerbacks on that roster and above average across the league at that position, was out against Chicago, and so was Kancey, who's one of the best young rookie defensive linemen in the NFL, and he's a candidate when it comes to defensive rookie of the year. I think he opened the year 20-1. So, yeah, I'm intrigued by this Bucs roster for sure. And again, I don't think it's just Baker. I think Canales deserves a lot of credit. Obviously, the skill position talent is there at wide receiver, but man, Dave Canales has done a heck of a job with Baker, and the fit is just so good scheme-wise, too.
It's a great observation by you. So much of what we see in the NFL these days is fit and chemistry and just being able to put players in the right place. You see the complete opposite of that in Chicago right now. So it's absolutely true. And, you know, as long as Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are upright and healthy, they're amazing receivers. It's an amazing duo. And I think that's gotten lost a little bit with, Tom Brady's decline since winning the Super Bowl and now Baker Mayfield taking over. They're amazing receivers. So that goes a long way into helping an offense for sure. And maybe even opening some things up in the ground game as well to take guys out of the box. So as constituted, the Bucs are far closer to a league average team, potentially winning a bad division, than they are being rated as the second worst team in the NFL before the season started.
This division gets really interesting as we move along the rest of the way because, as Mo and I touched on in our preseason editions of Beat the Closing Number and probably in week one, at that, Saints schedule is very easy. And I know you are a Derek Carr doubter, rightfully so, but passing defense-wise, schedule sets up well for him. Falcons are set up on the defensive side of the ball. I mentioned Jesse Bates and what the Bengals lost at safety. Heck of an offseason pickup for Atlanta, and that defense is built to sustain what they built on the other side of the ball, even though Desmond Ridder has a ton of question marks and then some. They're a run-first team and low ADOT, but unless Ridder is going to make terrible decisions, which he's probably gotten away with over the first couple of weeks, at least a handful of decisions that maybe could have gone the other way, and he also given away a couple of throws at that. But the running back tandem led by Bijan Robinson, who's one of the offensive rookie of the year candidates. So Carolina, even if you get more competent quarterback play from Bryce Young, we'll see how things go tonight. And like I mentioned, Steven, you have a bet on both Monday Night Football games that our viewers and listeners can find in the Discord channel. Link is over at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner. You can price shop for the best numbers and the best sportsbook promos there as well. I want to wrap with a futures bet that you may be betting and driving over the border maybe after we wrap this podcast. You're looking at Defensive Player of the Year, and even if you're not betting it, just to share it with our audience, viewing and listening audience, who you're targeting potentially in regards to that market.
You know, it's not often this early in the season that I bet a favorite in an awards market, but I think Micah Parsons is just taking over this league defensively. And there are some spots now where he is shorter than 3-1 after he opened the season around plus 750. But as we record right now, there is one plus 340 available, and you can use the prop finder tool at thelines.com to find that just under the odds tab. And just my eye on this, Eli, is if it's not going to be Parsons, then who? And at this point in my mind, it's going to require an injury for Parsons not to win this award, which is a violent sport, certainly possible, but I would much rather have a Parsons ticket in my account with a lower payout than taking a long shot on somebody here in this market who isn't going to beat Micah Parsons if Parsons stays healthy. This is the premier defense in the NFL.
And I do agree with that sentiment, but Myles Garrett and TJ Watt have to be right there too. And they are on the odds board.
Are they going to win 11 games though? Like, because that's the other part of this handicap is we don't like to talk about it as much, but usually it's not quite the same as MVP, but it's close. Like, you need to win games to win this award as well. So do we think the Browns or the Steelers are going to win 11 games or so? You know, I think we're both pretty confident that the Cowboys are 11, 12, 13 win team this season, maybe even more if they hit their ceiling, right? So that to me is the situation. I think Parsons is playing at an all-world level, and if they're all on the field and they're all healthy, I just don't think Garrett or Watt are going to have the production that Parsons does, or B, get nearly the same number of headlines that Micah Parsons gets. And that's the other part of this handicap is people vote on this. It's voters that you have to take into account here, not just your personal opinion of a player. So even if it's close, even if Garrett maybe has one more sack than Parsons, are they going to vote for him over Parsons if he's healthy with some of the advanced metrics and all the articles that are going to get written about him? So I'd rather have the Parsons ticket in my account right now.
Steven making smart decisions and giving out smart analysis even after maybe a hangover from Bruno Mars last night. I don't know what you and your wife decided to do pregame wise, or
when you have two young kids, Eli, Sunday concerts are rough. That's a tough turnaround to a Monday morning, getting the kids to daycare, okay? But Bruno Mars doesn't come to Louisville, Kentucky very often, so you got to make it happen.
I'm on the verge of, or I'm not on the verge, I'm planning a wedding as we speak, trying to plan a wedding. And it makes
I tried to get Bruno number so to be your wedding singer, but he's booked.
He was booked, yeah. Planning a wedding kind of makes me not want to have kids, but I will probably have to turn that around. A lot of opinions being thrown around. Let me just say that. But Micah Parsons, to your point, and there are you messaged me this before we got started. I think he opened the year at plus 700 before week 1. So there's a plus 400 available, to your point, that you can find over at thelines.com, and just click on the tab under any futures market for the NFL, under NFL futures, and you can click on Defensive Player of the Year. He's as high as plus 400, as short as plus 135, and still plus 340 at FanDuel if you just have a couple different sports books. We obviously urge you to get the best of the number and price shop, and it'll help you out. It's not just a benefit or us giving you reasonable and sound advice. It helps you out to price shop every week and get the best of the number. But there is a discrepancy in the market in regards to Micah Parsons' Defensive Player of the Year odds, for sure. So we're taking a note of, as Steven mentioned. But anything you want to wrap with, Steven, before we end the podcast, besides very sound and reasonable wedding advice?
Try to avoid Sunday night concerts. Don't think about kids while you're planning a wedding. Save it for later. And get the best of the number is a great advice. Ask the people who didn't get the best of the Eagles Vikings number. Ask the people who didn't get the best of the Packers Falcons number. Get the best of the number. Cash your bets.
That line is a perfect example, and I tweeted about that yesterday because it was as high in the Falcons' direction as plus 2.5 midweek before news came out, and the assumption was somewhat there, but that Aaron Jones and Christian Watson I was thinking of the old Packers, could both miss that game, and they did, and the line flipped. And for anybody that bet Packers plus 3, you cashed that. So you could have middled, even though it's a pretty slim margin there, and bet Falcons at plus 2.5 or anything lower or outside of a pick 'em, and come back the other way on Packers plus 3 and cash both bets if you wanted to get a little risky. But really fun podcast with Steven Andres. Be sure to follow him at Steven Andres. You can follow me on Twitter at Eli Herskovich. Mo will be back on Thursday's edition of Beat the Closing Number. So for Steven, for myself, Eli Herskovich, thanks for watching and listening to another edition of Beat the Closing Number. So long, everybody.